Section 4. When the estimate changes, what can move and what cannot. Sarah, they changed the numbers. Emily and Carlos have received their loan estimate, reviewed the proposed financing, and told Jason that they want to proceed. A few days later, Emily calls Sarah again. This time she sounds irritated. Sarah, I thought you said this was an estimate. Jason just sent us updated information, and some of these costs aren't the same. Can lenders just change whatever they want? There's a question almost every real estate agent eventually hears. The answer is no, but that doesn't mean every number must remain exactly the same either. Welcome to one of the most important concepts in TRID, tolerances. An estimate isn't a blank check. Let's think about why tolerance rules exist. If a lender could estimate a charge at $500 early in the transaction and simply change it to $2,500 immediately before closing, without restriction or explanation, the consumer's ability to compare mortgage costs would not be very meaningful. TRID uses a good fake standard for estimated closing costs. Under Regulation Z, whether certain estimated charges were disclosed in good faith can depend on how the amount ultimately charged compares with the amount originally disclosed. But, and this is important, not every charge is treated the same way. For practical purposes, we're going to organize many of these costs into three groups. Group 1, zero tolerance. Some charges generally cannot increase from the amount disclosed on the loan estimate, unless the regulations permit the creditor to use a revised estimate. People sometimes call this the zero tolerance category. Examples can include certain fees paid to the creditor, mortgage broker, or an affiliate of the creditor, as well as certain charges for required services when the consumer is not permitted to shop for the provider. The key lesson for Sarah isn't memorizing every possible fee, it's recognizing the concept. If a charge falls into this category, the creditor generally doesn't get to simply increase it because the original estimate turned out to be inconvenient. Group 2, the 10% cumulative tolerance. The next category gets misunderstood all the time. Certain charges may increase, but the applicable charges are generally measured together under a 10% cumulative tolerance. Depending on the circumstances, this can include certain recording fees and charges for third-party services when the consumer is permitted to shop but selects a provider from the creditor's written list. Here's the important word, cumulative. Imagine several qualifying charges were originally estimated at a combined $2,000. Don't automatically look at one individual charge and conclude that it violated TRID because that single charge increased by more than 10%. The applicable comparison generally involves the total amount of the charges within the category. That's why agents should be very careful before announcing that a lender violated the tolerance rules. Group 3, charges that can change. Then we have charges that aren't subject to the same 0 or 10% tolerance limitations when the estimates were based on the best information reasonably available. These can include items such as certain prepaid interest, property insurance premiums, amounts placed into escrow or reserve accounts, and charges for services the consumer was permitted to shop for when the consumer selected a provider not on the creditor's written list. Think about homeowners insurance. Emily may decide to purchase a different insurance policy than originally anticipated. The actual premium could be different from the amount initially estimated. That doesn't automatically mean somebody violated TRID. Then what's the point of an estimate? Carlos isn't convinced. If some numbers can change, why give us an estimate at all? Because the loan estimate still provides meaningful information that allows the consumer to understand the proposed transaction and compare financing costs. TRID doesn't promise that every variable connected with buying a home will freeze forever. It creates rules governing how estimates are made, how certain charges are compared with final charges, and when revised estimates may be appropriate. That is a very different concept. Here's where agents get into trouble. Sarah looks at one changed fee and tells Emily, "That's illegal. They can't change that." Be careful. Does Sarah know which tolerance category applies? Does she know who selected the service provider? Was the consumer permitted to shop? Was the provider on the creditor's written list? Did a changed circumstance occur? Was a revised estimate permitted? Those facts matter. A changed number is not automatically a violation. Sarah's better response is, "I see the amount changed. Let's have Jason explain what caused the change, how the charge is categorized, and whether it affects your final costs or closing timeline." That's useful transaction management without pretending to be the creditor's compliance department. What is a changed circumstance? Suppose the original loan estimate was based on one set of facts, but something legitimate changes. Maybe information relied upon in preparing the estimate turns out to be inaccurate. Maybe an unexpected event affects settlement charges. Maybe Emily and Carlos request a change to the loan. Federal rules recognize circumstances in which a revised estimate may be permitted. We're going to explore revised loan estimates and changed circumstances in greater detail later. For now, remember this. A lender generally cannot use a revised loan estimate simply because it made a bad estimate. There needs to be a regulatory basis for using revised estimates when the creditor wants to reset applicable tolerances. The Arizona transaction connection. This is where Sarah's knowledge becomes valuable. Suppose Emily changes something about the transaction that could affect financing. Sarah doesn't need to decide whether that event legally qualifies as a changed circumstance under Regulation Z. But she should recognize that changes in the real estate transaction can have consequences on the lending side. That means communication matters. Buyer, agent, lender, escrow, title, listing agent, broker. A seemingly small change can travel through the entire transaction. Broker tip: don't diagnose from one number. When a buyer says, "My costs went up," don't immediately respond with either, "That's completely normal," or "That's illegal." You probably don't have enough information yet. Compare the documents. Identify what changed. Ask why it changed. Direct the consumer's lending compliance questions to the lender. Then determine whether the issue affects the real estate contract or anticipated closing. That's professional transaction management. Emily and Carlos now understand that the loan estimate provides meaningful protections. But not every number is frozen forever. And we've reached an important point in their transaction. Their application is underway. Their loan estimate has been issued. They've indicated an intent to proceed, and they're beginning to understand how estimated costs work. Chapter 1 has given us the foundation. We're going deeper into what is actually inside the loan estimate, because understanding when the floor arrives is only half the battle. The next question is whether your buyer knows how to read it. Online discussion 1. Emily notices that one charge increased by more than 10% and immediately tells Sarah that the lender violated TRID. Should Sarah agree? Answer: no. Sarah needs more information before reaching any conclusion. Some charges are subject to zero tolerance. Certain charges are evaluated under a 10% cumulative tolerance, and other charges may change without those specific tolerance limitations. The applicable category can also depend on factors such as whether the consumer was permitted to shop and which provider was selected. Sarah should encourage Emily to obtain an explanation from the lender rather than independently declaring a federal compliance violation. 2. Why is the word cumulative important when discussing the 10% tolerance category? Answer: the 10% tolerance generally applies to the combined total of the applicable charges in that category, rather than requiring every individual charge to remain within 10% of its original estimate. Looking at only one changed fee can therefore produce an incorrect conclusion. Consumers should review the overall applicable charges and obtain clarification from the lender when questions arise. 3. How should an Arizona agent respond when a transaction change appears to affect the buyer's loan costs? Answer: the agent should promptly communicate the transaction change to the appropriate parties. Encourage the buyer to discuss financing consequences with the lender. Document important communications, and monitor whether the change could affect contractual performance or closing. The agent should not independently determine whether the event legally qualifies as a changed circumstance under federal lending regulations.